you know, I think the dad has to sit with Chaston. My husband and I have been talking about this a lot. Like, the dad should have to sit with like what he did.
The guilt, yes.
And there's so many parallels to what happens with Tanya, where he's like floating, right, when he seems like he's dying or maybe sort of dead. Yeah, I think just story-wise that otherwise, you know, I don't have a lot of notes for this year's White Lotus.
I mean, it was incredible. Awesome. I guess the one thing would be, does anything really happen to the ultra wealthy? Yeah, maybe that's what he's trying to showcase.
Which is kind of what always
they always get away with it.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, even the kid.
Even the kid.
Yeah, yeah, because by the time they're on the boat, it's like none of that even happened, right?
Yeah. And then the 4 security guards that are guarding the guy, they die.
Yeah.
No one talks about them.
No, I forgot about that.
Like those guys were assholes. They were mean to what's his name?
Yeah.
I'm okay with that. That's a good point. They were bullies, dude.
Really fell in love with that.
Yeah, dude. He had such a pure heart. Don't bully this guy.
Yeah, that's true. And then the 3 women seem fine after witnessing a mass shooting. Like they're just laughing, right?
Just on the boat, having a good time.
Yeah.
But yeah, in season 1, if you remember, the really rich kid like stabs the guy, and then he's just in the airport 20 minutes later or whatever. Yeah. No questioning, no nothing. And I think that's kind of to Andrew's point. Is like I think the point of that show is the ultra wealthy. One guy has his wife killed. Nothing seems to happen. They just kind of get away with it.
Right. But there is social mobility because Belinda joins the club. Right?
And the second she joins the club, what happens to her?
She seems fine.
She becomes the woman that she's always hated.
Yeah.
She leaves out porn.
She use the same language. I think she's like the same words.
I have to do something for myself.
Yeah. But like the whole show, I was worried about her. Like physically, not morally. Yeah. And it turns out I
thought that was a genius choice. You're worried about her well-being, and then she gets the $5 million. You're so happy, but then she also just kind of becomes gross right after. Yeah, you know what I mean. I thought that was a really good way. Money corrupts, baby.
Money corrupts. Speaking of, how do we corrupt you? No. What do we do? Like, I keep on hearing conversations about how we're going to tax people and make a lot of money. You know, I've been very fortunate. I've made a lot of money, and they're doing a really good job at it. So, how do we tax the people who really are making a lot of money? Like the guys who like send their wives to space for fun. How do we make sure? What did you think about that?
The spaceflight?
Yeah.
I'm glad they got back okay. I mean, I guess, I mean, it seems to me there's some other things we could probably be paying a little more attention to, but you know, it's exciting. Look, we're in this era of commercial spaceflight, which is exciting. Yeah. And I worked on this when I was Secretary of Transportation like that.
Oh, you were part of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's transportation, right? Our main thing was just making sure on the way, it's actually very Wild West right now, big picture-wise. The main concerns are making sure you don't hit anything on the way up, because you got to go through the national airspace, and that if anything blows up on the ground, you don't hurt anybody on the ground. Like, those are kind of the main like concerns. But eventually, we'll have to start regulating that like we do commercial air travel, right? In order to make it like now, I think there's a sense of fly at your own risk, right? Like you understand if you're being blasted into space.
Ask permission when you're ready to go? Is there
I'm guessing there's all kinds of. I haven't seen it, but I'm guessing there's all kinds of releases and paperwork.
If only we could talk to the transportation secretary.
But there's an understanding. There's a different level of risk, right? Yeah. Whereas on commercial aviation, we have zero tolerance for risk, and actually that's worked out pretty well, right? Like I think one thing that we always talk about the things that are going poorly. We pay attention to the bad thing before we notice the good thing.
It does feel like that a little bit recently, that the planes aren't making it as much.
Yeah, well, we can get into that. But we had 15 years with zero commercial airline fatal crashes. 15 years. Think about that. Like, just in the time I was secretary, we had about 4 billion people get on airplanes. Like, statistically, if you took your seat on an airplane and you were sitting there, buckle your seatbelt, eating your snack, you would be statistically more likely to randomly die of natural causes than to be involved in a fatal crash, right?
Wow.
And that didn't just randomly happen. That had years of technology, regulation, policy, like a lot of things go into that. And that's what it looks like kind of on the other side of that process, where with commercial spaceflight, it's very new, it's understood that it's very risky, and I guess that's okay. But I don't want to lose the first thing you asked about, which is taxation, because I think, you know, a big thing, I think most Americans, definitely my party, but I think most Americans believe that if you're making $1 billion, good for you. But like, you should at least be paying an effective tax rate that's comparable, or I would argue more, than like a firefighter. And that's not true right now. Like,
because nobody really makes $1 billion.
Right, because it's all equity, and it's like, you're not getting a paycheck.
Nobody makes income. Like, anybody that's generating that type of wealth is not making income. So it's almost like, and this is not like a woo-hoo, like, we got it so tough, but it's almost like the people who are, I think Miles used the term, like, not middle rich, like middle class, like, they're the ones that are actually paying what they should pay. If they're adhering to the tax code, they're not, hiring these tax attorneys that are going to, attack it all willingly and try to reduce whatever they're paying in. But let's assume, let's take it for face value, right? Somebody, an athlete or somebody that's making $5 million, and let's say that they pay $2.5 million around, right? The concern I have really is potentially the corporations. And I'm not smart enough to even know about this stuff, but it seems to me, and I think tariffs plays into this, so I'd love to get your take on it, but like, it seems to me on the surface, and again, I'm giving a very emotional argument, you can give me tons of data, call me an idiot for even thinking this, but it's possible.
I doubt it.
Okay, seems to me that there's been an effort that has been supported to, send the manufacturing of some of these products overseas to increase profits, right?
Sure.
Or maybe it's more effective to manufacture them overseas. Maybe it's not all nefarious, but the idea is to, like, to increase shareholder profits or increase the profits of the company, which I'm not necessarily against. What I'm against is when you also put these like shell companies overseas to decrease, like you create the headquarters and you put it in Dublin or something like that so you can avoid taxes. So,
and it's a P.O. box, like nobody's even there.
Exactly. So you can't do both. You can send the manufacturing overseas, but at least if we're taxing the revenue of that company that's generating billions of dollars, you would like to believe that money would come back to the American people, and then we could reinvest in the American people, and then maybe there's other industries that would pop up, and those jobs could transfer from manufacturing to those new ones.
Or vice versa.
Vice versa. But you can't do, to me, it just feels like if you do both, you are using the marketplace that America is, that really
entrepreneurship, all of that, but not really giving back.
And then stealing from it.
Yeah, there's no question, especially because a lot of what that tax revenue goes into or is supposed to go into here in the U.S. is what then turns around and makes it possible for businesses to thrive.
Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, my favorite example is probably the smartphone. So, have you ever noticed, like in like talks or like whenever somebody mentions a smartphone, they like start to pull it out of their pocket or like touch it. But so the federal government could not have invented the iPhone, right? Like I don't think any of us would want a phone that was like invented by the federal government.
That thing would suck.
That is like all of the design, the manufacturing, supply chains. That's the kind of thing that corporations can do very well, and Apple did it very well, and their competitors. But what makes the iPhone work? Well, among other things, the internet. The internet was literally invented by a federal research project. And it would never have been possible to invent the internet with a private company because you wouldn't have got the kind of capital return. Even though it's a $1 trillion idea or a multi-trillion-dollar idea, you know, companies can do multi-billion-dollar ideas, but a $1 trillion idea, like inventing the internet, that requires basic research. And that's the kind of thing the government's supposed to do, among many other things.
It requires basic research? What does that mean?
Yeah, by basic research, I mean things that are so fundamental that you actually don't know for 50 or 100 years if they're going to have a return. They might never work out.
Oh, right? Yeah. You can't look at it as this thing is going to be profitable. It has to be
so it's different
benevolent
from
endeavor for society.
Yeah, it's different from research on like a pharmaceutical company researches a new medication, expecting that they're going to
there's going to be a return in the next 10, 20 years.
Right, at least kind of within the kind of profit run.
But public parks is another version of this and stuff like that. It's like you can't privatize the public park.
Right. This is the whole idea of public goods. Right? This is why we have governments, why we collect taxes.
God, we're turning into such libs already, dude.
But there's a handshake, right? There are the things that only the government can do, and then there are the things that the private sector can and should do, and they meet in the middle. But if you start shorting, and part of what really worries me right now about this kind of war on academia, and there's some things about academia that need to change, but the war on academia, the cuts to cancer research, the cuts to science research, this kind of like general anti-science like atmosphere that I think is emanating from the administration, like that costs us in ways that don't show up on a corporate profit and loss statement 6 months from now or a year from now. But in terms of whether a country, a society, an economy is productive and is growing and is innovating, that starts to really cost you over time. And if we're shorting that, or if corporations and extremely wealthy people don't want to be paying into that through taxes, that is, I think, a classic example of a kind of short-term gain that causes long-term pain.
Yes.
And I'm really worried about that.
And I think that's why there seems to be a lot of support for the administration right now, or one reason why, and even support for the administration when it comes to tariffs. When the tariffs happen and you hear about like the stock market being deeply affected, most Americans are not invested in the stock market. So they're like, I don't give a fuck. Oh, rich people are losing some money? Or 50%. We can go off the numbers. Meaning there's a large swath of Americans that don't feel directly
Right, but here's the thing, right?
impacted.
Tariff, so part of what's happening is the markets are responding to their belief that the tariffs will probably make the world economy less productive and make a recession more likely. But a tariff is a tax that people pay on stuff they buy every day. And proportionally, if you're, middle rich, versus like people in the neighborhood I grew up in South Bend, Indiana.
Sure.
Like, proportionally, it's the people in Indiana who are spending a much bigger portion of their income at, let's say, Walmart. And everything at Walmart is about to get more expensive.
You're 100% right. I'm talking about the knee-jerk emotional reaction when you see, like, people who have money and have seemingly left you behind as they've gotten richer start to suffer a little bit. You go, yeah, I don't really care if you're suffering. In the same way that, like, when the Palisades fires happened, there was this sentiment of, like, oh, a rich person's third home is on fire. Right. They'll figure it out. Not this person's entire like life and belongings just went up in smoke. So I think that there is this like sentiment amongst a lot of Americans. You probably experience it where you're from. Just this kind of being like left behind. And I think this taxation of these corporations is a perfect example that really justifies that sentiment. It's like, why are you using the American marketplace and the support that we've given you and the lack of regulation? There's a reason why these companies don't sprout up in other countries, right? They sprout up here. And it's not just because they happen to be these unique, smart individuals. It's because there is this marketplace that allows them to thrive here. You don't get to remove the headquarters so that you can not pay your fair share of taxes that's going to then support the next generation of people who do the same thing. But how do you tax them? What do you do?
But look at what's about to happen, right? Like, as we speak, congressional Republicans are working on a budget framework that's going to cut corporate taxes. Like, that's one of the biggest things it's going to do. And even this president, the least popular he ever was last time around was when they passed his tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy. So a lot of this is about, look,
can I ask a question about that real quick? Is there a world where, and I doubt that this is possible, but is there a world where if they do that, it will influence companies that have gone abroad with their headquarters to come back here?
I think it's
I'm not
less
trying to
about
defend the
No,
administration,
I get that argument. But honestly, there are ways to structure taxes so that they capture where the value and the wealth is actually created.
That?
Like you can have a PO box in the Bahamas or Ireland or whatever. But so one of the things, for example, that happened in the last administration was an international agreement on like a threshold, a minimum, so that, and now it only works if everybody agrees on it. This is part of why diplomacy matters so much, right? But no other country really wants to see too much of that happening either. So there's a way to create a floor that gets you a more level playing field.
An international agreement for taxation of corporations.
Yeah, the
So, even if your account is in Switzerland, if you have $1 trillion in Switzerland or the Cayman or whatever, you're a trillionaire. You're going to get taxed as such.
Exactly. So it reduces the incentive to offshore your books.
Now, it kind of seems like you're making the argument for a tariff on Lesotho. Right?
Why? I don't know why they're beating up on Lesotho.
No, I think the justification for that was so that someone can't go put a manufacturing factory
fine.
on the plate.
Tariffs have their place, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
we don't think about tariffs yet, but just on taxation.
But again, what really worries me about tariffs is those don't amount to a tax on corporations.
They amount to a tax on consumers. Without that,
I'm going to push back. Sorry, I'm going to push back. And this is something Andrew brought up on a call that I completely agree with. And I'm an idiot. But I feel when people say these things, oh, the buck gets passed on to the consumer. That only happens because the corporations have exploited profits to the highest possible degree to keep their share price as high as possible. Things have gotten more expensive over the past 50 years every year. It's not just inflation. I think corporate greed is a big part of that. So why is it that now that there's a tariff, their profit has to stay the exact same and nobody's looking at them as perpetrators of any kind of greed? And it's just, oh, the United States government is deciding here's a measure to help middle America, and now we have to eat that.
But how is making middle America pay more a measure to help middle America, right? I mean,
well, I would, and I do think I get more frustrated with Democrats because I want very badly to be that. I definitely do not identify as conservative, but I find there's this. When I go to Middle America, and I'm sure you go there. We travel the country. Yeah, you live there. Yeah, that's what I meant to say. But it's like, oh, there's like decay in some of these places, and it doesn't feel like the party that I want to identify with has any empathy for them. And this, to me, was an idea that could help bring jobs back there. And I don't think the execution has been great from what I'm seeing, but this could help them. Why don't we look at any measure that could help them beyond, let's keep things the way they are, because the way status quo is not helping.
Yes, I agree on that. Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think what my party has to do is respond to this in a way that doesn't make it sound like our whole argument is let's just go back to 2024, right? Like things like this, moments like this, movements like the one that's in charge of the White House right now, don't spring up in a country or an economy where everything's going along fine. And look, I lived this too. I grew up in South Bend, Indiana. People think South Bend, they know Notre Dame. The big employer that propelled South Bend wasn't Notre Dame, it was Studebaker. Studebaker made cars. It was before the big three, it was the big four. And we were one of them. It dominated our city, grew our city. And then in 1963, they shut down. That's 20 years before I was born, and we were still dealing with it 20 years later. We were still dealing with it 50 years later when I became the mayor there at the age of 29. And what had happened was, when we were going to a school, I would go in between just acres of collapsing factories. It literally looked like a war zone. I have been to war zones that look very similar to the way a lot of places in the industrial Midwest, like where I grew up, looked because of some of these things you're talking about. Right. Which is why I think there's an appeal to saying we're going to bring back manufacturing, right? And by the way, again, I don't want to like move away from what I was saying that we shouldn't go back to where we were, because I think a lot needs to change. But I would point out that in our entire lifetime, the year when there was the most investment in factories in the United States, the most factories being built, was last year. Because there were a lot of policies, the chip stuff, the manufacturing stuff, trying to get more of the green economy stuff to be built on U.S. soil, that led to a lot of these factories. Now, a lot of them are still in construction as we speak. Some of them actually open, some of them still haven't. But right now, in Kokomo, Indiana, I just read a story today about 370 workers at Stellantis who just got laid off. Auto workers who got laid off because of the tariffs. So this is a tool that you can use for sure. But it's absolutely critically important that you know what you're doing when you do. And if you're just making shit up as you go along, or if you're doing it for a reason that's actually less about helping middle America and more about consolidating power, which is what I think is actually happening. We can get into that. Then it's not going to work. But I don't want to completely disagree with what you're saying earlier. Like, yeah, part of what's happening is, like, part of why things cost more is that they actually cost more. But also, we've seen a lot of expansion of the corporate profits that people cash in on, right? Which help to explain why a lot of things cost more. But to me, the answer to that is, okay, let's have a fairer tax system. How do we do that? Says, well, I mean, at risk of sounding simplistic, like you pass a law, like we can do this, right? It's not like profoundly mysterious.
For example, it's like it's not going to be income tax, right? Because they'll find a way to not have income.
So you can adjust capital gains, right? It doesn't have to be like all the way at the level that it used to be.
But even
with
capital gains, you're only taxing them when they cash out, and a lot of these guys won't cash out. They just take loans against their investments, and then loans aren't taxable, so they live for free.
Right. So that's where the idea of wealth taxes come in, right?
And what is that?
If you're just sitting on it at a certain point, especially if you're past a certain point in how much you're sitting on, you got to contribute a little bit. I mean, this is not a novel. Property taxes are that way, right? Like, you don't wait, depends where you live, but usually you don't wait until you sell a home to have to pay property tax on every year. Like, you contribute a little bit of the value of the real estate you're sitting on. And that goes to the county roads and the school and the sheriff's department, whatever else you count on, right? So like, there is a way to do that nationally.
But
we just haven't
property
had
tax is
political will
going
to do
to
it.
close that gap. I don't think it's going to close that gap.
I mean, if you had all of these, well, you have pieces of that, right?
No, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I think that there is this feeling, this sentiment, I think that Akash was tapping into as well. And there's two things. Like, you seem like someone who's very knowledgeable and very aware of all these things. You know these people that were fired in this random factory in, what'd you say it was, Iowa?
Kokomo, Indiana.
In Indiana, right? It's like, the average person might not know about that. They don't know about these factories being built. But you have to meet the average person where they feel emotionally. Yeah. And like, I think you do a really good job, and I've seen a lot of your interviews, is like, acknowledging the emotions of the people that you're talking to before giving them evidence that might be contrary to them. Yeah. Instead of this like finger-wagging approach, which is like, oh, you're stupid if you don't agree with me. Yeah. Really important. But just quick, like, I think the average like American isn't even aware that like what Amazon makes a year and what they pay in taxes. Like, I think they paid $0 last year.
Yeah, a whole bunch of these corporations.
And I get what they're doing. It's like they're writing off losses from other parts of the business, or they're reinvesting that money and growing the business. Yeah. And I don't want the pendulum to swing so far that you can't start a business and you can't grow and thrive. And I think that's like one of the great things about America. Yeah. But there has to be this middle ground. And if we don't do something about it, the American people should at least be aware of the, I don't want to say the CEOs, but the people that own these companies that are essentially stealing from the American people and using the system. Like, we should be aware of who they are. Now, I'm not saying we should do it.